Cancer. Right, good morning everyone. It's lovely to be here with our guests for this webinar today, and also with our audience. I hope that you'll be joining us at various points in the future to share this webinar and these reflections. We're very excited this morning to have a great panel of discussants who are going to talk to us from both parental perspectives and professional perspectives about the whole experience for young people who are adopted, both of lockdown and also of returning to school, whether it's now in July or whether it's going back in September, where there'll be another sort of set of considerations and plans for those young people. So I'm going to say a very big thank you to those participants who've joined us this morning, and ask you each to introduce yourselves, and then we'll think about what our kind of core purpose is for our hour together today. So I'm going to turn to Dave first of all, and ask Dave to give us a quick introduction, and then we'll go round each individual to say hello and give us a little bit of context about why this talk today, this discussion, is relevant to them and what they're bringing. Dave, over to you.
Lovely, thank you. Hi, I'm Dave Roberts. I'm Head of Outreach at the Mulberry charity, which is based in Oxfordshire. I lead the outreach service and the teaching school, and the Mulberry works with children who've experienced early life trauma and a breakdown of relationships. And I'm particularly interested in talking today because I feel that the issue about sort of adoptive children is really key at the moment, particularly in the COVID situation, when I think we're seeing increases in levels of trauma and disruption for children as we're preparing to get children back into schools. And we know that some children are going to be more vulnerable because of their experiences than others. So I'm looking forward to exploring that this morning with people.
Thanks, Dave. Louise.
Hi, I'm Louise Hockney. I am the parent of 2 adopted children. They are now 11 and 12, and they've been with us for 8 years. So they were adopted at a fairly late stage after a very extreme experience of neglect and violence and trauma. And they've had multiple difficulties, but I'm delighted to report we're definitely going in the right direction now. But for me, being here is a privilege because our relationship with schools has both helped and hindered us in many ways. And I'm hoping this will be a chance to help schools be more helpful. Yeah, that's where I am.
Thanks, Louise. Amelie?
Hi there, my name's Amelie Thompson. I am the parent of 2 adopted children, but also work in education as head of inclusion. So sort of here very much with 2 hats on. So my 2 children are 5 and 4, one in reception and one's about to start in September. And I think for me, really sort of bringing those 2 hats, I mean, adopting children is such an enriching experience anyway, personally, but it's also really enriched my professional experience and has really helped me to reflect on, going back to what Louise was saying, actually how schools can be helpful for our most vulnerable pupils, including adopted children. So yeah, really excited to be here today for this discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Amelie. That is such a, you know, wearing those 2 hats is such an interesting lens to bring, isn't it? So I hope we can really draw on that a little later. Lisa, over to you.
Thank you. So I'm Lisa Cherry, and I'm a trainer and speaker around trauma, recovery and resilience across all the sectors, but I spend a lot of time in schools. Academically, I'm going to be continuing my research based in the Rees Centre as a doctorate, looking at the intersection between school exclusion and looked after children. And then my personal lens, I suppose, that I bring, which I think really drives my passion and why I've been working in this field for 30 years, is very much having been birth separated, having been in care, having been excluded from every school I went to, etc. So there's a real, I guess, that academic, professional, personal lens, passion, and I don't know, knowledge base, I guess. I'm coming from all of those spaces really. So it's very lovely to be here, because anything that's about trying to support and encourage schools to work in ways that prevent our most vulnerable learners from being on a trajectory to exclusion and various other things is always going to be how I want to start my day. So
thanks, Lisa. That's brilliant. I love that passion, and I think everybody, we're a passionate crew here today. So I'm really excited about what's going to come out of that. Julie.
Hi, I'm Julie Greer. I'm a head teacher in a primary school, Cherbourg Primary School in Eastleigh in Hampshire. And again, a sort of lifelong career. I've been a head for over 27 years, but that's given me the ability to really sort of spread out, I guess, and influence across initial teacher education, for example, but also through special educational needs. And a sort of whole variety of other hats. So I'm really excited to be here today. Within school, we have over 20 children who are either looked after in special guardianship or who are adopted. And so it really is a subject very close to my heart, and about how we do pick up on those cues that Louise is going to be sharing with us as well, and Amelie, and really make sure that we do get it right. So yeah, very excited to be here. Thank you.
That's fantastic. That's our real ambition, not just to influence the thinking of teachers, of parents, but of leaders, and also of new entrants to the profession, those trainee teachers who can really shape the way in which we behave in relation to the most vulnerable. So fantastic. And Francesca.
Hi, I'm Francesca Wakefield. I'm one of the project managers with Whole School Send, which is a consortium bringing together schools, charities and the Department for Education to work towards improving provision for children with SEND and driving inclusion.
Thanks, Francesca. We're relying on you this morning to keep us on the right track. So welcome everybody, and a big thank you at the start of this to the Department for Education as well, who funded this opportunity today. And we hope that, as we said earlier, that our objectives are really clear, that actually we want something really tangible to come out of this in relation to supporting both parents and teachers in that return to school experience. What is it that in our reflections and our discussion we can really take away in order to not only help in the sort of short-term fix, if you like, of returning and responding, but equally in maintaining the spotlight that has been on vulnerable children since the beginning of this lockdown. Now, what would be a great outcome of the experience of COVID-19 is to maintain that focus on vulnerable young people and the support that's required for them through our professional engagement with them in the classroom. So fingers crossed that actually our outcomes today will really draw some very clear messages for this. I'm going to start now by asking Dave to sort of take us into some context so that for those watching, there's a real understanding of what the picture is currently for young people who are looked after or adopted. Dave, over to you.
Lovely, thank you. Okay, so I just want to spend a few minutes just sort of giving the context and thinking about what the needs for adopted children may be, but also what the needs for schools as a setting may be. And I think it's important that whilst we focus on the needs of children, we also sort of look at what are the cultures that we want to establish in our schools. And I'm just going to put a few slides on the screen as I talk. So what's interesting if you look at sort of the UK context is that we see that the number of looked after children is increasing in our country. Currently it's just over 78,000. We know that the levels of early life trauma are increasing. We see increasing levels of domestic violence, abuse, neglect, and that was pre sort of COVID. And I think what we're likely to see, and what we're already sort of starting to hear reports of, is that during the lockdown period, again, increases in domestic violence and neglect. And I think as we reopen schools and start getting pupils back in to schools, we're going to see the ramifications of that in our settings. So we're seeing an increase in the number of vulnerable children and an increase in early life trauma. But in relation to adoptions, actually we're seeing a decrease in the number of adoptions. So there's a sort of a mismatch there in terms of the increase of children who need that additional support, those stable relationships, and what we're currently able to provide. And just to sort of think about in relation to schools, there's around 42,500 children who are subject to have been adopted or guardianship orders, etc. So if we think about sort of the numbers of children, and sort of the ages of children when they're adopted. So I'm not going to go through all of this, you can see that. But what we can see is the vast majority of children are adopted between 1 and 4 years of age. But we also know that the process of adoption is still incredibly long. It takes on average about 1.5 years, which for a child that's 4 years old, that's a third of their life. That's a third of their life being removed from birth parents and potentially being placed with multiple foster families before they have a permanent sort of adoptive placement. And it's really key that we sort of recognise the early life impact of that breakdown of relationships. When we look at the picture for adoptive children in schools, it's clear that many children that are adopted absolutely blossom. They do fantastically. They're in a stable home, they're in a loving family, and they do absolutely brilliantly. But we also know that there's a number of children who really struggle in our school settings. They have increased emotional or health needs, they have increased exclusion rates. Now, if we consider sort of the impact of sort of early life trauma, we know that the majority of children who've been adopted have experienced a significant breakdown of relationships in their early life. They've experienced an early life trauma, most likely from abuse, neglect, domestic violence. And we have to remember that that has a profound and long-lasting impact on children. The fact that they're placed in a stable family and a loving home environment and a stable school does not remove the impact of that early life trauma. That early life trauma has shaped the child physiologically. And if we look at things like ACE scores, we know that the higher levels of emotional trauma in children's early life have a significant impact on their health, their access to education, things like their anxiety levels. What's it like having a really anxious child in the classroom? A child who perhaps is too anxious to listen and may be perceived as ignoring the instructions, but actually their head is just too full of anxiety to be able to cope with more instructions coming at them. Or what's it like to have a child who rejects the support offered by a teacher or a TA? But actually, rather than feeling that they're rejecting you, it may be that what that child is experiencing is, I was left helpless once, I'm not going to be left helpless again, so I'm going to shut the world out. We also know that if we look at our curriculum, there are certain topics that are going to be more difficult for some adopted children to engage with. So for example, we need to be mindful if we're thinking about ancestors, impact of evacuees during the war, family trees, things like that, looking at Harry Potter books, Goodnight Mr. Tom. Some of those curriculum subjects, which are fantastic subjects for most children, may well have quite a significant impact on some of the children who've been adopted, who have experienced that early life trauma, that struggle with relationships. And I think putting it into the current context in relation to sort of COVID-19, if we think that those children have experienced multiple breakdowns of relationships early in their lives, What they've experienced going into lockdown is, again, sudden break of relationships. Schools being suddenly closed into lockdown, the loss of peer relationships, the loss of supported TAs and teachers, which for some children may be re-traumatizing. Now, it's likely that those children can't verbalise that, but they will exhibit it through their behaviours. And I guess our task is to pick up on those behavioural changes and what those children are communicating unconsciously, and how we interpret the communication of anxiety or fear or panic from those children. We know that children who've experienced early life trauma struggle with transitions, and yet suddenly we've had this huge transition throughout lockdown of taking children, or some children, out of school, back into a home environment. Now we're putting them back into schools where there's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of anxiety from that child, from all their peers. But as staff, we're carrying our own anxieties. We've also gone through a traumatic event and carrying our own anxieties about COVID and the reopening of schools. Spoken quite a lot about sort of the impact of relationships for children, and it's really important that we recognise the impact of attachments for children. And although children who've been adopted may have a fantastic relationship with their adoptive families, their ability to create other attachments may well have difficulties. And that's going to be particularly influenced by things like COVID and that separation, again raising anxiety type symptoms which they carry from early in their life, from that sort of first year of life. And you know, we can talk about this subject, we can talk about the impact of trauma, we can talk about the statistics and stuff for a lot longer than we've got today. What I think is really important is that we recognise that for the children that we're working with, they may well have hidden needs. They may well not be able to say what those needs are, but they will be communicating it through their behaviours, through their anxiety levels, that we will pick up on. And to really recognise that if we're going to support children who've been adopted or other children who've experienced early life trauma, it isn't just about focusing on that child. It's about developing a culture where we can be aware of what's happening in the classroom, what's happening in the school, what's happening in families, and have a much sort of wider dialogue and discussion. And that's going to mean that staff teams need a greater understanding of what's happened to children and the impact of early life trauma, and opportunities to think about what COVID-19 has meant for adopted children, for their schools. Their school has experienced a traumatic event going into lockdown and reopening. And I hope that we can pick up on some of those issues today, though you know, we have a short period of time today. And I guess lastly, a quote that I particularly like, that, as I say, it's about looking at the culture that we're working within. So I'm going to sort of chip in later on and add other bits, but I think for now I'm going to hand over to Margaret to introduce sort of the voice of a young person who's been adopted. So Margaret.
Thanks, Dave. I think that's really powerful for us as a scene setter, both to understand the challenges faced by the young people, but also by the schools that are welcoming them back at the moment, and the broad considerations that are needed. And also that point about culture, we'll definitely pick back up as we go forward. You know, how do we establish cultures that are based on the behaviours and the experiences of everybody in that school setting? So we'll come back to that in a moment. As you say, we're going to go over now to Louise and Amelie. We're going to start with Louise. Louise, I have got a slide that we can draw up in a moment. Shall I do that now, even though we're going to start talking about your story first, I think, about your two young children who really do want to share with us their experience of lockdown. So if I bring the screen up, the slide up rather, would you tell us a little bit about how that experience as lockdown has started, and you know, your feelings at the moment. You said to us at the beginning that you're feeling pretty positive, you're heading in the right direction. We'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
So I've got two children who are birth siblings as well as siblings in my family, and their experience of lockdown has been very positive, and that is because their experience of school is very mixed. So they struggle with relationships with their peers. They struggle with anxiety, hypervigilance, and all the things that Dave really articulately outlined. So lockdown has been very positive for us. It's reinforced our family relationships. It's given them a break from the stresses and strains of outside life, outside the family. This is their safe place to be. So when they're outside of the home, they're always on a higher level of alert. I've noticed how much less they're sleeping, for instance, since they've been at home. What I would say is that makes me just a little bit worried about how going back to school is going to be. Anyway, here's my son explaining his feelings.
Has this come up on your screen? Because it's not coming up on mine at the moment.
No, I've just got Zoom.
Yeah. I'm going to stop sharing and ask Francesca if there's any way you can bring it up, because for some reason it's not sharing on mine. Thank you. It might mean, Francesca, that we have to just play the whole clip, because I won't be in a position to start it, I don't think. So I think that's fine with me. Is that all right with you, Louise? Yeah, I think I'd suggest to everybody who's listening to just jot down a few points that we might want to raise as we come back, because I think we're talking about several different aspects of experience from this young person, and it'd be good to tap into each of them in turn. So I think it's about 3 minutes. I'll hand over to your son to tell us what he feels. No? The joys of technology.
Margaret, I could probably play the sound only to you.
Okay, that would be great. Let's try that. Because I think it's really important we hear his voice.
Can you hear this?
For you? How has it affected you and your learning?
Can you hear it?
Well, it's affected me in a very good way. I've been finding organisation better, and my work has been due, and there's been no background noise and no shouting.
So when you say no background noise and shouting, what's that mean?
The teachers shouting at the naughtiest students.
Can you hear that all right? Is that working or not?
That's working fine. So should we pick up on that point first? So he feels it's actually been a really good experience working during lockdown, and that's because of the fewer distractions.
That's because, you know, hypervigilance and anxiety about violence in particular, and you know, if you've had a very violent experience as a very small child, quite minor things feel very violent to you. So people shouting at each other is really scary. And unfortunately, it seems that is something that happens in schools. So children shout at each other, they push each other off the pegs in the school cloakrooms, they shove each other in the playground, and no one thinks anything of it. But if you're a child that's been a victim of extreme violence, you do think something of it. You find it frightening. You know, so that's kind of just one example of how anxiety is released over lockdown, because you don't have to deal with all this stuff that goes on.
I think can I just pop in there as well, Louise, and say that I think often what we find is that children similar to your son will mask in school, so they look like they're coping, so they have all of these strategies because there are I guess there are boundaries, and there are people all there to maintain those boundaries. So you know, children will sort of look like they're okay, and then they will go home exhausted, because actually the energy that it's taken for them to manage all of that external noise, whatever that might look like, has been so much. So it's you know, I'm unsurprised that actually just being in a safe place has enabled him to just be able to breathe a little better.
Well, and academically to fly. I feel vindicated, because no one's believed me for 7 years that this was a really clever child, and suddenly they're all saying to me, he's really clever. And it's like, yeah, because if you take away all the stuff that's stopping him, you know, do his academic work, then you get what's really there. Because a lot of these children don't achieve because, you know, as Dave was saying, their heads are so full of all the other stuff that they're trying to manage that they haven't got room for the academic stuff. How do you want to play this, Margaret? Do you want me to talk about?
Yeah, I think it would be much better to just talk it through, because we know his voice is there, you know, at the core of this, and he's explained in a very articulate way, hasn't he? Both the sense of success, but also the anxieties around returning. So talk us through a bit of that.
This is where I do that passionate thing you were talking about, because this is something I feel really strongly about, because as you know, I've had a very mixed experience with schools, very mixed. Some brilliant, some shockingly bad. And what I would say is 2 huge points that I have to make. One is, please believe this. What Dave is saying is true. And I have come across so many teachers that say to me, oh yeah, all children are like this. That's their favourite thing. All children are like this. I'm like, no, all children are not like this. All children have not had this experience in their early years. All children have not been abandoned by their birth mother. All children have not been taken off in a police car when they're 2 years old with the lights going. That's not all children's experience. I do understand other children have difficulties, but this is a very extreme experience. And you need to take that on board. And that sounds so simple, but I've had so many teachers kind of go, that crazy Mrs. Hockney again. Come up to the school to tell us why her children are so very special, you know, and I've had that happen a lot. So I think I beg you to listen, really, is my first thing. Just believe that this, even if it doesn't feel like it's true, honestly, it really is. And then the second thing is, I think it's really scary for teachers, because they're already so busy and so overwhelmed by the needs of so many children. And they hear this tale of woe and they think, oh, how can we cope with this as well? And the fact is, although particularly my children, their experience is very, very extreme, actually a string of very small things transforms their experience. It is not expensive, it's not time consuming necessarily. You know, they just need a point person. They need somebody in school that is available to them whenever they need them. You know, I'm sure that you're familiar with Safe Place to Be, but when Safe Place to Be was brought into our local school, it changed their lives, because suddenly when they were having trouble in the playground, which might be being pushed around, or it might just be, I'm really lonely and I've just been told I'm ugly and no one wants to play with me, but it's okay because I've got this card in my pocket. I don't need to explain to anyone. I show them the card and I can go indoors and read a book. Because before that, they weren't allowed to come in without explaining to somebody what the problem was. Well, that's where you get that silence that you're talking about. Because who wants to put their hand up and say, everybody hates me, can I come in? Nobody wants to do that. So, safe place to be, somewhere that you can retreat to, safe person, a person that you can talk to. And then really small things. Sit this child at the front of the class where you can see what's going on. You know, kids used to crawl under the desks to right the way across the classroom to pinch my kids. You know, people used to, but if they're sat in front of the teacher, that's not going to happen. Sit them next to a kind child. Sounds really obvious, but as soon as you say, put me at the front of the class, you then get sat next to the most naughty child in the class. Don't do that. Put them next to someone kind. Ask them how they feel when they're on their own. Just one of the things that made an enormous difference for my children was having a teaching assistant who asked them to help them every break time on a Thursday for 15 minutes. And they stacked books and they put pencils away. But during that time, that teaching assistant asked them how they were. They asked them if they were okay. They asked them how their relationships were. Because as Dave says, and as Julia said, these children don't tell you unless you ask. Don't assume that a teacher once said to me, but I'm really approachable. All the kids can approach me. Well, I'm sure you're really nice, but this is not about you. It's not about how good you are. It's not that I think you're not very good. It's that they have needs which are different, which aren't necessarily obvious to you. You know, I'd love it if everybody who was teaching would go away and read Dan Hughes and would go and look at all the workbooks that the wonderful Karen Treisman has created, but they don't have time to do that. So if you don't have time to do that, listen to Dave, you know, or me, or somebody. Listen to someone who has got all the background reading, puts it all into a little box and says, here's what you can do. You know, I just wrote down the 3 best things anyone ever said to me in my journey as a parent. And Dave sort of touched on this. All behaviour is communication. Connect with a child before you correct them. So, yeah, it's okay to say, do you know what, you can't run round and round the classroom like a maniac because it's distracting everybody else. But before you do that, say, I guess you must be feeling really bad today, right? Because otherwise you wouldn't be doing this. But do you know what? It's still not okay. Can we find another way to express your feelings? And then lastly, the treasure chest idea, which I love, which is so important, which is you can't just have a go at a child all the time. Give them something, give them some treasure, give them a bit of, do you know what? That was such a lovely picture you did today. Let me give you a treat for that. So that they can build up self-esteem, because these kids do not have self-esteem. That's the fundamental issue. And, you know, I was saying to Margaret as a parent, you know, my kids went to school with a heart-shaped button sewn in their trouser pockets every day. Most of them, they still sometimes will say, Mummy, I need a love token today. You know, write them notes that you can hide places so that when no one's talking to them at lunch and they open their lunchbox and they're sat on the table all on their own, they open it and there's a big heart from Mummy. You know, because as Dave rightly says, they may have a good connection, you may have a good relationship with them as a parent, but their ability to hold on to the knowledge of that attachment is challenged. So you need to help them remember that Mummy still loves them. And the number of times I say, I still love you when I'm at work. I still love you when you're in the playground. I still love you when you've forgotten all about me. I remember you, you know, and they need to know that because they can't hold the connection. And yeah, connect with the child. You know, how do they know that you're connected with them? If you're a teacher writing on the board, well, they know if you make eye contact with them. They know if you use their name. They know if you mention something about them that you've remembered. So my daughter's teacher will often say to her, because she reports it back to me every time, well, you're very good at horse riding, so I imagine you could use that in your maths. So she remembers that there's something that she's good at and then connects with her that way. So, and these things are really small, aren't they? They're not expensive. They're really quite small things, but they transform the experience. And if these things are put in place, you end up with a child like my son, who has gone from special nursery because he wasn't meeting any of his milestones to functioning brilliantly at the local grammar school, where I've got all these emails. I'm like, is this really him? I've got all these emails saying how wonderfully he's doing and how much he's fitted into the community and how he's got all these friends which he's never had before. So, and they've put in place these measures because they listened when I went in before he went to the school, and they've listened and they've done it, and now he's no trouble to them. They hardly ever engage with him anymore because they don't need to, because he knows they're there as a backup if he needs them. And they freed him to go forward. So,
and I remember, Louise, on his video that he was actually talking about, whilst things have improved so much, knowing that he has a particular person he can go to at any point in time, and also knowing that he has the cards in his pocket, the green, amber, red, those things provide that sort of safety net for him.
Yeah, so that is exactly like going out in your car without your seatbelt. Without those cards, he's in the car driving 100 miles an hour without his seatbelt, thinking I might crash and then I'm going to die. Whereas with the seatbelt on, he's thinking, well, I might crash, but I've got my seatbelt on. It's okay. I'm going to be all right. It's a safety net.
Yeah.
Because he can't hold on. He can't hold on to the idea he's safe. You know, very easily.
Those thoughts and those sort of provocations, if you like, are so valuable, I think, to teachers, because I think teachers worry so much, don't they, about their skill set. And what you're saying is, you know, this doesn't involve, there are skills involved, but actually it doesn't involve anything too dramatic, too different, too out of our reach. But I'm going to come back to you very shortly, but I'm going to go over to Amelie now and say, I know that you've been nodding and that resonates so much with you, and it must be a real dilemma sometimes being both a parent and a teacher and feeling these tensions about those small steps that Louise describes so well that can make such a huge difference to young people. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience of lockdown and return, Amelie?
Yeah, I mean, so, as you said, so much of what Louise has said really resonated, and you know, the fact that Dan News was mentioned, I think is so important, because for me, you know, relationships are key, but key to a relationship is being curious, and I really like the way that sits in Dan News's model of, you know, playfulness, acceptance, curiosity, empathy, and I think, you know, certainly thinking about my own experience as a professional and how adopting children has enriched that experience is really understanding the power of curiosity with the child, understanding the child, but also again how by being curious and listening to the parent that opens up such a, you know, an absolute treasure chest of support. And I think it's, you know, Louise touched upon it, we know that in schools we're really busy, we know that there's lots of pressures on teachers. We know that there are lots of conflicting and often at times very perverse incentives around what it is that we need to manage, and that can feel at times very conflicting. But what we do know is that if we get the relationship right, actually in the long run, we save ourselves a lot of time. And I remember one situation, this is a professional situation, I was working with a really vulnerable child, and just at the end of the week, I sort of tallied up all of the hours that I'd spent either with the child or with the parent or in meetings about the child. And I think I got to about 14 hours, and I just thought to myself, do you know what, if I've spent 14 hours on this, I could have spent 14 hours differently. I could have, there has to be a better way, because actually this is just, we're adding additional layers of stress, we're adding additional layers of trauma, and actually if we need to start flipping it around. We need to start thinking to ourselves, actually, going back to what Louise said so eloquently, how do we connect in with this family, with this child in a different way so that we're really building on the strength? And I think, I mean, obviously for me, lockdown has been different because my children are still really young. I don't know whether I've used lockdown as an excuse for justifying that playing in the mud was our home learning experience, but that's absolutely what we did. We spent a lot of time you know, outdoors in local woods, and, you know, which has been fantastic. It's been a great experience. And as Louise said, you know, a way of really solidifying our relationships. And, but I think probably for me, one of the biggest things that has come out through lockdown, particularly thinking about September and my daughter starting, is I felt an overwhelming sense of, I think probably anger actually, at the fact that they'd missed so many developmental milestones. And actually here we are, yet another disruption, which I think Dave touched upon as well. You know, it felt like a loss. And I think adoptive parents, and it's something again I've learned really as a professional, we do a lot of the holding, trying to hold the trauma, trying to hold the anxiety for our children, because we want to protect them from it, because we know that it's there, we know that it exists, and we don't want them to have to, you know, they do carry it, but we don't want them to carry it. And I think, you know, that those feelings of, you know, how do we prepare the family for that return back to school, where there are these really strong feelings around actually how are my children's needs going to be met, how their developmental almost rights going to be met, what's that going to look like. And I think it's about really having that communication from the very, very start with parents of adopted children, and committing to that being really regular. Pragmatically, there's not time to have, you know, really, really long meetings, but really pragmatic, short touch bases, where there's opportunities to share and to connect, and for children to see that connection as well, and to transfer that attachment. Yeah, sorry, I'm trying to capture. There's so much to capture, isn't there? I don't know. I think if there's one thing I really want to stress, it's just, you know, curiosity and not making assumptions. And it's by really listening to the children. You know, behaviour is a communication, absolutely the case for my children. They're 5 and 4. They've expressed their experiences of lockdown through their behaviours, through initially their anxieties and their hypervigilance, moving to a state of actual, you know, a lot more of calm. And we've got to tune in, and we've got to tune into the parents, and the system has got to be able to tune in, which has organisational implications, which I know Lisa's going to talk more about. But that, let's not make assumptions, let's be curious when working with children.
That's a lovely bridge over to Lisa, actually. And, you know, I think that whole concept of teachers being curious is something that Julie will tap into as well, when we think about how we develop teachers, and why, you know, active listening and noticing is such an important skill that perhaps we don't teach as explicitly as we might. But so that's something I'd love Julie to draw on in a moment. But let's go over to Lisa. Lisa, we're very keen to hear from you about that sort of resourcing our teachers better, resourcing those around the young person, and building their capacity, and your views on how we might do that best in this current context. Over to you.
Brilliant, thank you. And can I just apologise in advance for having far more slides than I'm going to be able to look at. It's just that I knew that lots of people were speaking before me, so I wanted to get a real sense of what the conversation. So if I skip through slides, that's why. So really, the exploration for me in this very short 10 minutes was around an understanding that in order to build the kind of relationships that make the difference, we need to have those needs met for ourselves. And I think it was very interesting listening to Dave and to Louise talking about the real lack of understanding about the impact of early childhood trauma, and actually what it means to live in several different places during that particular stage of development. And that's because it is really difficult to understand that if you haven't experienced it. So if we're not going to have voices of adults talking about those experiences and sharing them as a means of developing how we think about them and how we develop policy, if we're not going to have voice at the heart of that, then that misunderstanding is always going to be a challenge for us. Also thinking about the, understanding the impact of relational poverty and fractured beginnings, and I guess this is what I'm referring to, is difficult from a place of relational privilege. If you have the privilege of relationships in your early life and across your life course, and you've not ever explored what it is to build a relationship, what it takes to build a relationship, and where your own sense of safety in relationships comes from, then it's going to be very difficult for anybody to make any sense of and understand what that privilege is against somebody that has not had those experiences. Another part of this exploration, of course, is that we understand that it all begins with the adults in the school community, and that self-collective and organisational care strengthen the empathy muscle for everyone. And the empathy muscle is something that I think has been strengthened during lockdown, because people have had experiences of adversity that they may not have had before, which has helped people to have a deeper understanding about, for example, isolation. For example, what it means to be cut off from the people that you love. So some of those things that people have had happen to them offer a different personal experience upon which to draw from in understanding things more deeply, having more compassion. I just wanted to pull up the 16 points that came out of the government, not because I want to particularly highlight some of the horrendous things that are in here, although by definition I have highlighted them. But what I was more concerned with actually is that relationships are not written down in here anywhere. So these 16 points in terms of how children are coming back into school in September really, first of all, fails to take into account that the adults coming back into the school community have also been in a pandemic and have also had their experiences of what that looks like. And the second point fails to think about relationships. I would be remiss not to draw your attention to the last but one point that I've highlighted, which really shows a deep lack of understanding coming from guidance. You know, this is what we're kind of working with. This is in the guidance around really, well, read for yourself and work with that yourself, because I could spend weeks unpicking this particular 16-point document. So the adults coming back into the school have also been in a pandemic. They've also experienced health concerns, potential challenges around finances, the whole shopping queue thing, relationships, grief and loss, isolation, pressure. Most people around me are experiencing something: loss, relationship breakdown, deterioration in mental health. There are things happening for people all around me who ordinarily were not having all of those things happening to them. So nobody has been spared from the impact of this. And I think that's really important, because we've changed. And there isn't necessarily, I certainly don't think that basic neuroscience is understood in the education system, which is that our experiences create our internal architecture through the firing of neurons. I'm being really basic here. But if we understand that, then we know that we're not going back to something. We don't go back to something. We have changed. And so we need to be thinking about that change and what that looks like and how we're going to really work with that shift when children are coming back into school. I just would like to draw attention to the guidance for developing relational practice and policy, which is a 77-page document that I think anyone who's interested in looking at relational practice in education, this is a joint piece of work between Babcock and Devon County Council. It's well worth just having a look through that PDF, just to add to some of that knowledge base after this, after watching this, so that people can have an opportunity to think about, what does it actually mean to be relational? What does that look like? How do we achieve that? We know that focusing on relationships is where we are going to have the best possible, I don't really like to use the word outcomes, because what are those? But the best possible outcomes for children in a learning setting. We need to have a lot of thought really about relationships. Why are they so important, particularly now? And already we've heard that, you know, there is a spectrum of which children where school was their safe place, it was removed overnight. That relationship has been ruptured and will need a serious repair. For children who have been at home where school wasn't their safe place, they are now being asked to go back into that environment. So that relationship also needs to have significant relating and repair work, so that it's not ruptured before it even begins. The latest research isn't fantastic about potential negative impact upon mental health for children and young people. We weren't in a good place anyway. And this potentially for some children is going to become worse. And for some children, of course, not having the pressures of school, not being made to fit into a square hole has actually improved their mental health. And I guess that's why the word curious, Amelie, is the key here, because one of the greatest challenges for leadership is going to be holding such a diverse amount of experiences. How do you hold so many experiences, many of which will be utterly and completely beyond your comprehension, outside of your experience? So curiosity is going to be really key for us in that regard. So at the point of school reopening, we need to be thinking very much about social and emotional well-being. And there is a really counter narrative that we're hearing around placing social and emotional well-being at the heart of re-entry. And that counter narrative, earlier there's a big bit of Twitter noise about an article this morning that was titled, "Children will need boundaries, not hugs." And I think that counter narrative is really interesting, not least because the sort of remnants of a Brexit argument, this idea that, you know, you have hugs or boundaries, this idea that actually hugs and boundaries come together. So I'm quite aware that this is going to be a difficulty for us, managing those counter narratives to placing social and emotional well-being at the heart of the September return to school. And some schools we know do that anyway. You know, they just do that anyway. And we know that for other schools, they really don't. All staff, it's very much my view that basic neuroscience, an understanding about attachment, some knowledge around the impact of trauma is an absolute basic requirement for anyone working with children. I have no doubt in my mind that when people know better, they do better. When I've got people in front of me and the penny drops and they start to understand what I'm talking about, I see them go bing, 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 and they get it because they are driven to do the best by those children. You know, essentially, we get up in the morning to do our best, but we go from the place that we are in our own neurodevelopment. So for me, there is definitely a knowledge issue. Moving on from the knowledge issue, there is definitely then how do you go from a place of knowing to a place of being? Because we all know that people know lots of things about, they'll say to me, oh yeah, I've done attachment. I'm like, that's interesting. You've done attachment. 30 years I've been at it and I'm working on it every day. So we have to get into this understanding about culture, which has been mentioned, and how we have a culture that is about what does it actually mean to be that knowledge? Where is it in our policies? Where is it in the way that we talk to each other and care for each other? What are we modeling? Where is it in the way we are with our children when they're struggling? How are we with ourselves when we're struggling? What does it look like for me to struggle? Do I go and hide in the cupboard, or do I find someone and say, I'm struggling, and they go, yeah, I could see that. I'm gonna come and actually support you with that. Or yes, I can see that. It's a really difficult day to day, isn't it? You know, how are those connections that people have with each other that are not based on judgment and that are compassionate and understand that, you know, we're all working through this thing called life, you know, and how do we do that with each other? So actively promoting staff wellbeing is key, because it's not going to happen passively. It's not something that just happens, and apart from because you have a couple of really nice people on the team. Actually, how do you build it in so it happens? How do you ensure that you've got mechanisms in place like supervision, like mentoring, like having proper consultation about what you're comfortable with, what works for you? How do you have those emotional check-ins? How do you connect on a personal level? And this isn't the job of the head teacher. This isn't the job of the nice teacher. This isn't the job of the Senko. This isn't the job of the DT. This is about a culture, otherwise people will get very tired. We all have to somehow build in things that mean that we can all, what we might call relationally dose through the day, so that not some people are getting exhausted from being that person. And actually, sometimes that exhaustion is actually about not being able to deal with your own stuff. If you keep yourself really busy caring for everyone else, you don't have to look at what's going on for you. We want to be looking at creating a safe environment. If the adults in the community do not feel safe, the children are not going to feel safe. It really isn't any more sophisticated than that. If I don't feel safe, then my behaviour will let you know that I don't feel safe. As a 50-year-old woman, that might involve me saying, I've got to go now. You know, I can leave. A child can't leave. So we have to make spaces where the adults feel safe. How are we going to work on our own regulation so that we can build in those safe things? Well, we can do some calming and regulating brainstem activities. And how do we do those with the children? How do we do those in our classrooms? How do we make sure that we understand regulation so that the adults can be the co-regulators? I realise I might be slightly going over time. My passion takes me over. Consultation, always connect, reach out, emotional check-ins. Stress reduction and emotional equilibrium is the overarching concern. Because actually, essentially, this is about all children in school. But when we do this for all children, then the children who really need it are going to be okay.
I think that's so important for us, Lisa. Thank you. I mean, your message there about, you know, what's good for these young people and what's good for our teachers too, it's good for everybody. And I see the sort of, you know, is it Maslow and Bloom conversation in your slides there. There's been quite a lot of talk as well, hasn't there, about that sort of concept of Maslow, that sort of safety and well-being before the academic. But I think your point's been very well made around, you know, it's not one or the other. And if it is a focus on one, then it's not going to be a sustainable focus, because this is about changing those behaviours to be rather than to fix a space. Thank you so much for that. I mean, that really builds us well in our kind of understanding of this is about everybody. This is about teachers, this is about young people. And also what's good for a child who's been adopted or looked after is actually good for everybody. And I think your point there is something I know Julie and I have championed in relation to special educational needs specifically. But what we're talking about here, and what you said right at the beginning when you introduced yourself, was that you're actually about vulnerable young people. It's not necessarily about the label or the category, but actually recognizing that vulnerability. So thank you for that. I think that was just so helpful. Julie, I'm going to come over to you as a school leader, as a head teacher, and ask, how can we build on what Lisa's been telling us here and what Louise and Amelie have said, and the context that we found ourselves in, that Dave introduced us to at the beginning? What does that mean for leadership, do you think?
A very good question, and it's so lovely to hear everyone's passion across, you know, such diverse experiences. And I suppose the first thing I want to say, and that I feel passionately about, is that it is doable. It is doable, but we must never assume it's done. And I think that's a really key point, because as school leaders, we must never be complacent. You know, even listening today, you know, I'm writing things down because I'm being challenged, and I'm thinking, do we do that? No, not enough. We used to do that. We need to come back and do it again. So it's about that constant reflection, and I guess reflexivity as well, that we are, as staff members, I know a couple of people have mentioned supervision and mentoring. I think these are going to be more and more key over the next year, 2 years, and hopefully then setting practices that will go on into the future, so that we are challenging our practice. Margaret, you picked up on teachers as noticers, and that's already something I've got in my brain and written down for September already. For our staff, we're having discussions about teachers as noticers, and I think that can be applied across all types of the pedagogy, but it is specifically in relation to vulnerable children, specifically in relation to our adoptive children. Do we know what it is we need to notice? Do our, you know, what's the training in relation to that, so that our teachers pick up not just on spotting the positives? And I think it was lovely, Louise, you talking about, you know, it is that specific praise that is so important to those vulnerable young people, so that not only does that help their self-esteem, but they actually have a hook. They have something specific that they realize that it was that particular thing that I did well. And I think that's really important. It's too easy for teachers to just say, great, well done, fabulous. You know, I do it all the time, but let's go back to saying, I really like the way you spoke to me just now. I love the tone of your voice. It really made me listen to you straight away. So that we're not, you know, we're taking time, not only to notice, but to reflect back as well. So I think that's very vital. I've written a sort of handout that people can have access to as well, that picks up on some of those key points, and I am very conscious of time, but I think it is around, we talked about safe spaces. Let's remember though, as schools, those safe spaces may have gone because so much has changed in the environment. Have we moved out the soft cushion? But actually, let's just do a risk assessment on it. If that's a place where that child needs to feel safe, then let's risk assess it. Let's make sure it is absolutely fine, because it will be if we just have some basic rules around it. And just lastly, Lisa, absolutely picked up on your point there, but we have something we talk a lot about, of boundaried flexibility. So we work a lot. We have a resource provision for children with social, emotional, mental health needs, some of whom are also looked after, and so we do need boundaries. That's really clear. But we are flexible. We find routes always, and that's not just me. That's not just, you know, the team that are working. It's everybody. That's a whole school approach. And I think that's the difference between let's stop doing little individual things and let's actually have strategies that can really change and improve and develop a school culture.
Julie, thank you. Strategic approaches then, so key to this, that we can actually, our expectations of leaders is to have those sort of strategic approaches to the most vulnerable, but that actually put relationships at the centre of their thinking, and that capacity to notice and engage and connect. So much food for thought there, and I'm sorry we haven't had longer, but everybody here today has actually put resource together that we can share through this webinar, and we're hoping to do a next step. And I think a next step, another webinar would actually be, Amelie, wouldn't it? One that where we could actually have much more open discussion. What we needed today was to really give everybody an opportunity to sort of work through some of the core issues and think about what some of those key steps might be. And I think we've got some very tangible things that we can take away. I'm going to go to everybody for just one comment on what they think the most important thing would be to support next steps. It doesn't have to be encompassing everything, but just something to take away. And we will be sharing resources that underpin those with everybody who watches the webinar today. And I know that I would like to say thank you to your son, Louise, for sharing his thoughts with us. I'm sorry we didn't get to hear it all, but his final comment was, please listen to me and what I need. And very, very positive about his school experience, but constantly saying, please hear me, please hear my voice. Louise, what would you like to have as your takeaway, your desert island takeaway?
Tricky one, but I'm gonna go with my son really and say, listen to us and think about it, and don't think that you're under attack just because we're saying something that is different or you've not heard before. You're not under attack. We're looking for friends, That's
a really good point.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think that's really important for teachers to hear. And also your point about it not being complex. We're not expecting the world and new knowledge.
Not expecting the world. And the one thing we haven't talked about, and I just, Amelie, is, adoptive parents often have quite a lot going on that they don't necessarily spell out to you in great detail unless you ask. And, we hold a lot of their trauma and their stress, and stuff happens that just doesn't happen in ordinary, what the hell's that? But stuff happens. We watched a very simple film yesterday afternoon, family film, it was all lovely, but unfortunately there was a big argument in it, and then my son was in tears for an hour because he can't really cope with conflict. So then there's lots of talk about, why conflict is so hard to manage. Blah, blah, blah. Anyway, that went on for like an hour and a half. So of my day, where normally you'd watch a film and say, that was fun, let's all go to bed. It wasn't like that at all for us. So that kind of thing happens all the time. And I'm not saying that to moan, I'm saying that to just understand that we're not the enemy either. We're just trying to do our best. And quite a lot of the time, we don't know what we're doing.
You as parents are our resource, aren't you? As teachers, we need to tap into you as our resource. Amelie, do you want to give us, I'm really sorry I haven't come back to everybody, but do you want to give us the final word on this, really, around, what we take away and what we might take from the next get together that we have as a webinar?
I think what Louise said and what you've just echoed, Margaret, about, we are all, thinking about Lisa's slides as well, as we are all in this together, we are all wanting to do the best, and that, and that is, I think, as Lisa said as well, there's nobody is in education not wanting to do the best, but sometimes we don't know what we don't know. And it's in tapping into everybody's resources and knowledge base and really listening in, and also the child's, because what I always notice, what astounds me about my own two children is how much they understand themselves of what's going on. They're so small, but they've had to, they were born needing to survive, and they have such a unique understanding actually of their own lives. And actually, if we really start to tune in to what they're saying to us as well, how much we learn from them. And I think it's noticing, isn't it? It's noticing the child, it's noticing the parent, it's noticing the organisational culture, it's noticing ourselves, how we are influencing our interactions and how we connect, and not being afraid to challenge ourselves, to challenge within our organisation, and to not see that as a threat. Professional challenge is a positive, and it's a way of growing and taking, moving everything forward in the right direction. And I think for me, noticing is such a small but powerful tool that we can do collectively.
Fantastic. Yeah. Thank you, Amelie, and thank you to everybody. I'm just going to say that the resources that Dave had put together for us, the audio of Louise's son, the ideas about what will support from both Amelie and Louise, and then a checklist really for leaders, and Lisa's slides will all be available as part of the webinar output, if you like. So we really encourage people to start with listening and finish with listening. So we'll put Louise's son out there for speaking on our behalf in asking us all to listen more actively and to engage with these resources and to think about that relational practice that Dave and Lisa really sort of exemplified for us today as well. Thank you, everybody. I hope that this has been helpful, and we hope to revisit with a second webinar shortly. So we hope we can build on some of the thinking from today. But thank you, everybody, for participating and for your voices on behalf of young people. We really appreciate it. Thank you.